The screams pierced through the African night like daggers of terror. In the darkness of 6.4 million years ago, when death stalked every shadow, a female Homo habilis named Kira pressed her trembling children against the cold cave wall. Outside, the bone-crushing laughter of giant hyenas echoed through the savanna predators twice the size of any modern beast, with jaws powerful enough to snap elephant bones like twigs. Tonight, they had come for her family. The pack leader's yellow eyes gleamed in the moonlight as it approached their refuge. Kira knew the bitter truth. Hiding wouldn't save them. The scent of fear had already betrayed their location. As the massive predator's claws scraped against stone, she realized there was only one way her children would survive this nightmare. She would have to become the monster the hyenas feared. But what she was about to do would change her forever and reveal a darkness within early humanity that history tried to forget. The acrid smell of blood hung heavy in the pre-dawn air, mixing with the metallic taste of fear that coated Kira's mouth. She crouched at the entrance of their shallow cave, her weathered hands gripping a sharpened piece of bone so tightly that her knuckles had turned white beneath the grime. Behind her, huddled in the deepest shadows, her two children, Nico, barely 4 seasons old, and little Asha, who had only recently learned to walk, whimpered softly. Their large, frightened eyes reflected the dying embers of their fire, the last barrier between their family and the horrors that prowled the savannah. Mama ... double quotes, Nico whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant whooping calls that seemed to come from every direction. Are they coming closer? Kira's jaw clenched. She could hear them, the Crocuta spelea, giant hyenas that had terrorized these lands for millennia. Their bone-crushing laughs created a symphony of nightmare sounds that made her primitive brain scream with ancestral terror. These weren't the scavengers of later eras. These were apex predators, standing nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, with skulls large enough to house a human head and teeth designed to crack through the thickest bones. Stay quiet, my little ones, she breathed, never taking her eyes off the darkness beyond their cave. Mama is watching, but watching wouldn't be enough. Not tonight. The pack had been tracking them for 3 days now, ever since Kira and her children had fled their tribal settlement after the Great Drought scattered their people across the unforgiving landscape. Food was scarce, water even scarcer, and the giant hyenas had grown bold with hunger. A low growl rumbled from somewhere in the thick acacia scrub 50 paces away. Then another, deeper and more menacing, answered from the opposite direction. Kira's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized the terrible truth: they were being surrounded. The moon cast long, twisted shadows across the rocky outcropping where they had taken refuge. In the pale light, she could see dark shapes sliding between the thorny bushes with predatory grace. Yellow eyes began to appear in pairs, reflecting the moonlight like malevolent stars. 1, 3, 5, 7 sets of eyes. 7 giant hyenas. More than enough to tear apart a small family of early humans. Kira's grip tightened on her bone weapon as memories flashed through her mind, memories of other nights like this. Other families that hadn't been fast enough or clever enough to escape. She had seen what remained after the hyenas finished their work. Scattered bones picked clean, skulls crushed like ripe fruit, and blood-stained earth that took months to lose its crimson stain. Mama, I'm scared, Asha whimpered from behind her. I know, little flame, Kira whispered back, using the pet name she had given her daughter for her fierce spirit. But fear can be our friend tonight. It will make us strong. The largest of the shadows began to emerge from the scrub, the pack leader, a massive female with scars crisscrossing her muzzle and shoulders. Even in the dim moonlight, Kira could see the intelligence in those predatory eyes, the calculated way the beast assessed their position and defensive capabilities. This wasn't going to be a simple attack. This was going to be a siege. The alpha hyena let out a low, rumbling chuff, a sound that made Kira's blood run cold. It was a call to the others, a signal that the hunt was about to begin. The responding calls echoed from all around their cave, confirming what Kira already knew. They were completely surrounded. As the first drops of her children's tears hit the cave floor behind her, Kira made a decision that would either save their lives or damn them all to a death more horrible than she could imagine. She was going to fight. The giant hyenas moved with the patience of seasoned killers, their massive forms gliding through the moonlit savanna like shadows given flesh. Kira watched in horrified fascination as they positioned themselves in a perfect circle around the rocky outcropping, cutting off every possible escape route. The pack leader, a scarred matriarch with one ear torn to ribbons from countless battles, settled onto her haunches just beyond spear range. Her yellow eyes never left Kira's face, and in that predatory gaze, the early humans saw something that chilled her to the bone: recognition. This hyena had hunted humans before. "Mama, why don't they attack?" Nico whispered, pressing closer to his mother's trembling form. Kira didn't answer immediately. She couldn't tell her son the truth, that the hyenas were waiting for exhaustion to weaken their prey, for fear to cloud their judgment, for the fire to die completely. These ancient predators understood psychological warfare better than any human army would for millions of years to come. A sound like grinding stone echoed from the darkness to her left. One of the smaller hyenas was gnawing on something of bone by the sound of it. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who resist us. "Listen to me carefully," Kira breathed, her voice so low that her children had to strain to hear. "When I give the signal, you run. Not to the open savanna, they'll catch you there. Run to the thorn thickets behind the cave. Crawl deep into the thorns where their big bodies can't follow." "But Mama," Asha started to protest. "No!" Kira's harsh whisper cut through the night air. "You do exactly as I say. Hide in the thorns until the sun is high in the sky. Then run toward the great river. Find other humans. Live." Tears streaked down both children's faces, but they nodded solemnly. Even at their tender ages, they understood the gravity of their situation. In this harsh prehistoric world, children learned about death before they learned to walk properly. The pack leader rose from her haunches with fluid grace, her massive head swaying from side to side as she tested the air. Kira could smell her own fear sweat mixing with the musky odor of the hyenas and the lingering smoke from their dying fire. Then, without warning, the alpha female opened her massive jaws and released a sound that would haunt Kira's nightmares for the rest of her life, a laughing howl that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. The other hyenas immediately joined in, creating a cacophony of maniacal laughter that echoed off the rocky walls and filled the night with pure auditory terror. The sound was so overwhelming that little Asha clapped her hands over her ears and began to sob uncontrollably. Even Nico, trying so hard to be brave, couldn't stop his body from shaking. But the laughter served a purpose beyond psychological torture. It was a coordination signal. As the howling reached its crescendo, 3 of the smaller hyenas began to move. Not toward the cave entrance where Kira waited with her pathetic bone weapon, but toward the sides of the rocky outcropping, looking for alternate routes up the stone face. These predators had done this before. They knew that cornered prey always watched the obvious approach while ignoring the flanking maneuvers. Kira's head snapped left, then right, as she spotted the climbing hyenas. Their claws scraped against stone as they sought purchase on the rocky face, their powerful shoulder muscles bunching and releasing as they hauled their massive bodies upward. "They're coming from the sides," she hissed to her children. "Get ready to run." But even as the words left her mouth, she realized the horrible truth. The hyenas climbing the rocks were just another distraction. The real attack would come from the front, led by the alpha female, the moment Kira turned to face the flanking predators. The trap was perfect, inescapable. The dying fire behind them flickered and dimmed, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock their desperate situation. In minutes, maybe less, the last light would fade completely, and in the absolute darkness that followed, the hyenas would have every advantage. As if reading her thoughts, the pack leader took a single step forward, her massive paws making no sound on the sandy ground. Her lips pulled back in what might have been a grin, revealing teeth longer than Kira's fingers and stained yellow with the blood of countless kills. The message was clear. Your time is up. The attack came with the swiftness of a lightning strike. The alpha female launched herself forward just as one of the flanking hyenas reached the top of the rocky outcropping. Kira spun toward the sound of claws on stone above her head, raising her bone weapon to defend against the descending predator exactly as the pack leader had predicted. The maternal instinct overrode tactical thinking. Instead of meeting the alpha's charge, Kira threw herself sideways, pushing her children deeper into the cave, just as massive jaws snapped shut where her head had been a heartbeat before. The hyena's breath was a hot, putrid wind that reeked of rotting meat and death. "Run!" she screamed, even as claws raked across her shoulder, tearing through hide clothing and flesh alike. "Run now!" Nico grabbed his sister's hand and bolted toward the narrow gap at the back of the cave that led to the thorn thickets. Their small forms disappeared into the darkness just as the second hyena dropped from the cave ceiling, landing with bone-jarring impact on the stone floor. Kira rolled away from snapping jaws, her bone weapon spinning from her grasp. The cave suddenly felt impossibly small, filled with the massive bodies of two giant hyenas whose combined weight was more than 10 times her own. The alpha female's yellow eyes glowed with predatory satisfaction as she stalked forward, her shoulders rolling with each measured step. Behind her, the second hyena circled to cut off any retreat toward the cave entrance. "You want me?" Kira snarled, pressing her back against the cave wall. "Come and take me." She grabbed a burning branch from the dying fire and thrust it toward the nearest hyena's face. The beast recoiled with a startled yelp, the flames reflecting in its eyes and casting wild shadows on the cave walls. But fire was a temporary deterrent at best. Already, the other hyenas from the pack were climbing into the cave, their claws scraping against stone as they hauled their massive bodies up from the savanna below. Kira swung the burning branch in wide arcs, keeping the predators at bay, but she could feel her strength ebbing. Blood flowed freely from the gashes on her shoulder, and exhaustion from 3 days of constant flight was beginning to take its toll. The alpha female seemed to sense her weakening. With a low growl that sounded almost like laughter, the massive hyena began to advance again, ignoring the flames that licked at her scarred muzzle. "Mama!" Nico's voice echoed from somewhere in the thorn thickets behind the cave. "Mama, are you coming?" The sound of her son's voice gave Kira a surge of desperate strength. She thrust the burning branch directly into the alpha's face, and when the hyena flinched backward, she bolted toward the narrow gap where her children had disappeared. Sharp teeth grazed her leg as she dove through the opening, tearing fabric and flesh, but missing the major muscle groups that would have crippled her. Behind her, frustrated snarls and the sound of massive bodies trying to squeeze through an opening too small for them echoed through the cave. But her relief was short-lived. The thorn thickets were a maze of razor-sharp branches and tangled vegetation, and in the darkness, every direction looked the same. Worse still, she could hear the hyenas spreading out around the rocky outcropping, their haunting calls coordinating a new strategy. "Mama, here!" Ash's small voice came from somewhere to her left. Kira crawled toward the sound, her hands and knees tearing on the thorns, fresh blood marking her passage through the undergrowth. When she finally reached her children, she found them huddled in a small clearing barely large enough for the 3 of them. "Are they following us?" Nico whispered, his eyes wide with terror. Kira listened to the sounds of the night around them. The hyenas' calls had grown more distant, but she could still hear them moving through the brush, their massive bodies crashing through vegetation that would have stopped smaller predators. "They're looking for another way in," she whispered back. "But they're too big to follow us here." It should have been a moment of relief, but Kira felt only growing dread. She knew these predators too well. If they couldn't reach their prey directly, they would find another way. And as the first gray light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, she realized what that way would be. The hyenas weren't trying to get into the thorn thickets. They were going to starve them out. Dawn brought no mercy, only the harsh revelation of their true predicament. As pale sunlight filtered through the thorn canopy above them, Kira could see the extent of the trap they had fallen into. The hyenas had positioned themselves in a loose circle around the thorn thicket, close enough to prevent escape, but far enough away to avoid the worst of the thorns. Their patient predatory eyes tracked every movement within the undergrowth, waiting for hunger and thirst to drive their prey into the open. "I'm thirsty, Mama," Asha whimpered, her small voice barely audible above the rustling thorns. Kira's throat was parched too, her lips cracked and bleeding from 3 days without adequate water. The children were in even worse condition. Their small bodies could unsurvive dehydration as long as an adult. Through gaps in the thorny branches, she could see the pack leader lounging in the shade of a nearby acacia tree, her massive head resting on her paws like some nightmarish version of a domestic dog. The hyena's eyes never closed completely, always maintaining that predatory vigilance that had made her species the most successful hunters of the Pliocene epoch. "Tell us a story, Mama," Nico said softly, trying to distract his little sister from their desperate situation. "Tell us about the first people." Kira's heart clenched. In their tribe, storytelling was how knowledge passed from generation to generation, how children learned about the world and their place in it. But what stories could she tell now? What wisdom could prepare them for a world where giant predators hunted their kind like prey animals? "Once," she began, her voice hoarse with thirst, "there lived a woman much like your mama. She had 2 children, brave and clever like you. But the world was cruel, and the great hunters came for her family." As she spoke, Kira's eyes never left the watching hyenas. The pack leader had lifted her massive head, as if she could understand human speech, and was listening to the story with predatory interest. "What did the woman do?" Asha asked, unconsciously pressing closer to her mother's warmth. "She made a choice," Kira whispered. "She chose to become something more dangerous than the great hunters themselves." A distant rumbling sound made all 3 of them freeze. It wasn't the laughing call of hyenas. This was deeper, more rhythmic. Like thunder, but thunder that never ended. "What is that?" Nico breathed. Through the thorns, Kira caught a glimpse of something that made her heart race with desperate hope. A massive dark shape moving across the savannah, accompanied by smaller forms that kicked up clouds of dust. A herd of early elephants migrating toward the great river. The sound of their passage was like an earthquake, hundreds of tons of prehistoric pachyderms moving in formation, following ancient paths worn into the earth by countless generations. And they were heading directly toward the thorn thicket. The hyenas had noticed too. Several of them rose from their resting positions, their heads turning toward the approaching herd with obvious concern. Even giant hyenas didn't challenge a full herd of elephants, especially not when the massive bulls were a must and ready to kill anything that threatened the group. But the pack leader remained where she was, her intelligent eyes calculating distances and timing. She had survived this long by being smarter than her prey, and she wasn't about to abandon a guaranteed kill for the uncertain prospect of scavenging elephant remains. The thunder of elephant feet grew louder, and Kira could feel the ground trembling beneath them. The herd would pass within 100 paces of their hiding spot, close enough to create the chaos she desperately needed. "When I say run," she whispered to her children, "we follow the elephants. Stay close to the big one's feet. The hyenas won't risk attacking so close to the herd." "But Mama," Nico protested. "What if we get stepped on?" Kira's smile was grim as she watched the first of the massive elephants emerge from the heat shimmer. "Then we die quickly instead of slowly. Sometimes, little hunter, that's the best choice we have." The pack leader's ears suddenly perked forward, and she rose to her feet with fluid grace. Her yellow eyes locked onto the thorn thicket with renewed intensity, as if she had just realized what her prey was planning. The race was about to begin, and only one family human or hyena would survive the stampede that was coming. The earth shook with the power of primordial titans as the elephant herd approached, their massive forms emerging from the heat haze like prehistoric gods walking among mortals. The lead bull, a creature whose tusks could have speared 3 humans at once, raised his trunk and trumpeted a warning that echoed across the savannah. "Now!" Kira hissed. She burst from the thorn thicket with her children pressed close to her sides, blood streaming from fresh cuts as the razor-sharp branches tore at their skin. Behind them, the hyenas erupted into action, their bone-crushing laughs splitting the air as they realized their prey was making a desperate bid for freedom. The pack leader moved like flowing shadow, her massive form covering ground with terrifying speed. But she had miscalculated. The elephant herd was closer than she had realized, and the lead bull's eyes were already locked onto the predators with the kind of hatred that could only exist between ancient enemies. "Stay by the feet." Kira screamed to her children as they ran toward the approaching giants. "Don't get separated." The first elephant they reached was a massive female, her tusks worn smooth from decades of stripping bark and defending her young. She barely seemed to notice the 3 small humans who pressed themselves against her legs as she continued her steady march toward the river. But the hyenas were not so easily deterred. The pack had spread out in a hunting formation, with 3 of them attempting to circle around the elephant herd while the others pressed the direct attack. Their intelligence was terrifying, even in the chaos of the stampede. They maintained tactical coordination. "Mama, look." Nico pointed toward their right flank. 2 of the smaller hyenas had flanked wide and were now racing back toward them, using the elephant's own bulk to mask their approach. They would emerge from between the massive legs just as Kira and her children passed, striking like prehistoric lightning. But the elephants had not survived millions of years by being passive giants. The matriarch whose legs had sheltered them suddenly swung her massive head toward the approaching hyenas, her trunk whipping through the air like a living weapon. The first hyena tried to dodge, but the elephant's reflexes were faster than anyone had anticipated. The trunk caught the predator across the skull with a sound like a tree branch snapping. The hyena's body flew 20 paces before crashing into a termite mound, its neck bent at an impossible angle. The second hyena skidded to a halt, its predatory confidence shaken by the sudden brutal death of its packmate. That moment of hesitation was all the elephant needed. She charged forward with surprising speed for something so massive, her tusks lowered like ivory spears. The hyena fled, its tail tucked between its legs. But the pack leader was not so easily discouraged. She had circled around the herd's flank and was now approaching from the opposite direction, her scarred muzzle pulled back in a silent snarl of determination. "She's coming!" Kira gasped, her lungs burning as she tried to keep pace with the elephant's ground-eating stride. The alpha hyena's approach was perfectly calculated. She would strike just as they passed a gap in the herd formation, when they would be momentarily exposed between the protection of one elephant and the next. Kira saw the gap approaching a space of perhaps 10 paces between the matriarch they had been following and the next massive bull. 10 paces where they would be completely vulnerable. "Hold tight to each other," she commanded her children. "Whatever happens, don't let go." They reached the gap just as the pack leader made her final sprint. The hyena's muscles bunched and released with explosive power as she launched herself through the air, her massive jaws opened wide enough to encompass a human head. But instead of fleeing, Kira did something that no prey animal in the hyena's experience had ever done. She turned and charged directly toward the predator. The bone weapon she had thought lost was somehow back in her hands. She must have grabbed it during their flight through the thorns without realizing it. As the hyena's claws reached for her throat, Kira drove the sharpened bone upward with all the desperate strength of a mother protecting her young. The weapon punched through the soft tissue beneath the hyena's jaw and into the roof of its mouth. The predator's triumphant snarl became a choked gurgle as blood filled its throat. But the hyena's momentum carried them both to the ground, rolling in a tangle of claws and teeth and human flesh. Kira felt ribs crack as the massive predator's weight crushed down on her, felt claws rake across her arms and chest, tearing away strips of skin. Through the red haze of pain and blood, she could hear her children screaming her name. The pack leader's yellow eyes, now clouded with approaching death, fixed on Kira's face with a mixture of surprise and something that might have been respect. No human had ever fought her like this. No prey had ever shown such courage. With a final, shuddering breath, the great hyena went limp. Kira pushed herself out from under the massive corks, her body screaming with pain from a dozen wounds. Around them, the elephant herd continued its inexorable march toward the river, the other hyenas scattered and demoralized by the death of their leader. "Mama!" Nico and Asha ran to her, tears streaming down their faces as they saw the extent of her injuries. "I'm alive," she whispered, pulling them close with arms that could barely move. "We're all alive." But even as she spoke the words, she could feel the warmth of blood spreading across her chest and abdomen. The pack leader's claws had gone deeper than she had initially realized. They had won the battle, but the war for survival was far from over. 3 days later, Kira sat by the great river's edge, watching her children play in the shallows while she pressed moss against the deepest of her wounds. The healing properties of the riverside plants were already working their ancient magic, but she knew that some scars, physical and mental, would remain forever. The elephant herd had moved on, following their eternal migration routes, but their passage had left clear paths through the thorny scrubland. Other early humans had found these paths and followed them to the river, creating a temporary gathering of scattered tribes united by their need for water. "You killed the Night Queen," said an old woman named Bara, one of the tribal elders who had emerged from the drought-scattered communities. "The stories will be told for generations." Kira looked down at her hands, still stained with the blood of the giant hyena she had slain. "I did what any mother would do." "No," Bara shook her graying head. "Most mothers would have hidden. Some would have run. A few might have fought. But you hunted the hunter. You became the predator." In the distance, Nico was teaching his sister how to use a sharpened stick to catch the small fish that swam near the riverbank. Their laughter carried on the evening breeze, a sound of pure life that stood in stark contrast to the bone-crushing calls of the hyenas that had nearly killed them. But Kira could still hear those calls in her nightmares. And sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, she wondered if the pack leader's spirit was still watching her, still calculating, still hunting. "The others want to make you a war chief," Bara continued. "They say someone who can kill the Night Queen can lead them against all the great predators." Kira watched a fish dart between her son's fingers, quick as mercury. "I don't want to be a war chief. I want to be a mother." "Sometimes," the old woman said softly, "we don't get to choose what we become. Sometimes the world chooses for us." As the sun set over the African savanna, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Kira felt the truth of those words settling into her bones like a permanent ache. She had saved her children, yes, but in doing so, she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She had killed an apex predator with nothing but bone and determination. She had proven that humans could be more than just prey, more than scavengers living in the shadows of greater beasts. But what kind of world would that create for her children? What kind of future awaited a species that had learned to hunt the hunters. "Mama," Asha called from the water's edge, her small voice bright with innocent joy. "Look what we caught." Kira smiled and walked toward her children, leaving bloody footprints in the sand behind her. Whatever the future held, whatever kind of creatures humans would become, her family would face it together. Behind her, barely visible in the growing darkness, Yellow Eyes watched from the thorny scrubland. The Night Queen was dead, but her daughters had inherited both her intelligence and her hunger. The war between humans and hyenas was far from over. It had only just begun. And in the deepest caves of the savannah, where shadows gathered like living things, other predators were taking notice. The small, weak apes had proven they could kill. Now it was time to see if they could survive what was coming for them in return. The night was young, and in prehistoric Africa, the night belonged to monsters. But now, for the first time in history, some of those monsters walked on two legs. To be continued.